I lost my daughter right in front of my own home. Then I uncovered a sick plot that went all the way to the courthouse. And then, the first time I felt something shift in my daughter, it wasn't after a fight or a loud argument. It was after a golden sunset, the kind that makes everything feel like it'll be okay. I was locking up the little design studio I'd built from nothing in a converted firehouse in Old Savannah, feeling proud that a client had just booked our biggest ad package yet. I tossed my bag over my shoulder and called to Ray, the college intern I could finally afford to pay a full-time wage. "Email me that banner layout by morning," I said. He nodded, earbuds in, halfway through a soda. The clock said 5:10, and I was already running late. Tessa hated when I wasn't the first mom at pickup. The drive to the aftercare building was short, but it cut through the historic district, and every light seemed to turn red just to remind me of the things I tried not to think about, like the way Graham used to say my business was a phase, or how he left the divorce mediation with that smug smirk after telling the judge she can't even afford after-school care on her own. That was 2 years ago. He'd been so confident the judge would side with him. But I had receipts, tax records, a clear plan, and above all, I had Tessa's drawings, page after page of me and her in stick figures, always holding hands. When I pulled up, she was waiting by the glass door with her little hands pressed against it like she'd been watching for me the whole time. Her smile could still erase every ounce of stress, even when I was exhausted and bone-deep tired. "Mommy, I made a kite today," she said as she jumped into my arms. "Miss Elna said it's the best one because I used real string." I kissed her temple and told her I couldn't wait to see it at home. Dinner that night was Evelyn's chicken and rice casserole. The same recipe she made when I had my first heartbreak at 16 and the same one she'd brought over when she moved in to help me raise Tessa. Losing my dad had gutted her, but she'd packed up her house in Macon and joined us in a week. She never said the words, but I knew she came because she saw what Graham was doing long before I admitted it. Later, when Tessa was in the bath, surrounded by so much foam you could barely see her tiny face, Evelyn asked, "He's coming Saturday?" I nodded. "His bi-weekly," I said flatly. "And Isabel's coming too." He mentioned it like it was some special treat. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, but said nothing until we'd poured ourselves cheap coffee and settled in the living room. "You think she's trying to play house?" she asked gently. "Or just marking her territory?" I shrugged. "She's sweet on the surface, but I don't trust that sweetness. It feels curated." I didn't want to say it out loud, but I hated when Tessa came back quieter than usual. It hadn't always been like that. When Graham first moved into his townhouse and brought Tessa over, she'd return with her usual chaotic energy, talking nonstop about his fish tank or how he let her eat cereal at night. But lately, she came back slower, more measured. She never said anything was wrong, but she stopped talking about Isabel altogether. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan until the blades blurred, replaying everything I knew about my ex-husband's ability to twist perception. Saturday morning, I packed Tessa's little red backpack with a fresh set of clothes, her favorite blue dinosaur shirt, a travel toothbrush, and the emergency inhaler we hadn't needed in over 6 months, but I refused to stop sending. She was quiet, sitting on the bed hugging her battered stuffed rabbit while I zipped the bag. "Be good, baby," I said, crouching to her eye level. "I'll see you Sunday night." She nodded, but it wasn't her usual happy nod. It was the kind kids give when they're pretending to be okay. When the doorbell rang, I checked the peephole and saw them. Graham in a navy blazer he probably didn't need, Isabel beside him in one of those creamy coats you know cost more than your rent. "Morning," he said, voice polite but stiff. Isabel smiled too wide. "Hey there, sunshine," she cooed to Tessa. "We're going to have so much fun this weekend." Tessa gave a small wave. I handed Graham the inhaler and said, "She was coughing earlier. Just keep an eye out." He nodded like I'd told him the weather forecast, and they turned to leave. I watched from the window as their SUV pulled away. The moment they disappeared around the corner, that anxiety, the one that lives in the bones of every mother, crawled back into my chest and refused to leave. Evelyn stepped behind me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "She'll be okay," she whispered. "Kids bounce back better than we do." I nodded, but I didn't believe it. Not entirely. That weekend, I kept myself busy with client work, tweaking a multi-page restaurant branding pitch I hoped would land us enough income to finally hire another designer. But every time the phone buzzed and it wasn't Graham with an update or a photo, I found myself wondering what they were doing. When Sunday came and they pulled into the driveway, I stepped out before they rang the bell. Tessa got out slowly. She looked tired but not upset. "We went to the aquarium," she said when I asked. But nothing more. No stories about jellyfish or sea otters. Just that one sentence. When Graham left, I asked, "Was everything okay this weekend?" He shrugged. "Yeah, just normal stuff." Then "Isabel's waiting," and he walked off. That night at dinner, Tessa didn't touch her peas. When Evelyn offered apple crumble, she just said she wasn't hungry. I thought maybe she was just tired, maybe overstimulated, but Tuesday night something in me snapped. I watched her draw a picture before bed and noticed she'd scribbled out one of the people in it. "Who's that?" I asked gently. "Nobody," she said. "Just a mistake." That mistake sat in my mind all night. I wasn't sure what was happening yet, but I knew something had started, and I was afraid I might be the last one to realize just how deep it went. By the following Thursday, the quiet had started turning into a low-level dread I couldn't shake, like the moment before a storm where the air changes but no rain has fallen yet. Tessa was still polite, still smiled when I picked her up, but it was different, like she was acting, hitting her lines on cue, but with no real presence behind them. Her teacher, Miss Brennan, called me after school hours, her voice tense but professional, the kind of tone people use when they're worried but don't want to scare you. She said Tessa had stopped raising her hand in class and had drawn 3 pictures that day, all using black and gray crayon, which was strange for a kid who used to build entire rainbow cities on paper. She said she was drawing her house, Miss Brennan told me. But when I asked who the people were, she said she didn't remember. I told her we were going through some transitions at home and promised to talk to Tessa, but I was already biting my lip hard enough to taste blood. When I got home, Evelyn had made stew, something she always pulled out when she sensed I was unraveling. I waited until after dinner, until the dishes were done and Tessa was playing with her dollhouse, to ask. I sat on her bed while she sorted through mismatched doll shoes. "Did you like your visit with Daddy last weekend?" I asked, careful to keep my voice light. Tessa didn't look up. "It was fine," she said. I pressed a little more, asking if she and Isabel did anything special. She shrugged. "She painted my nails, but then told me to wash them off before I came home, so you wouldn't get jealous." The way she said it, like she was repeating something drilled into her, sent something sharp down my spine. I waited a beat. "Tessa, what else did Isabel say?" She didn't speak for a moment. Then, without looking up, she whispered. She said maybe I'd live with her forever soon. I didn't panic, not out loud. I said something neutral, like, "Oh, and that's interesting," before hugging her and tucking her in, but I swear my pulse didn't settle until almost 3 in the morning. I called Aaron, my lawyer, the next day from my office and told him everything. "You think he's building a custody case?" I asked. "Wouldn't he have to notify me?" Aaron was quiet for a second before saying he would. "But that doesn't mean he won't try something underhanded. We've seen worse." He told me to keep track of everything and to stay alert for changes in behavior or language. That weekend, I canceled all my meetings and told Tessa we were going on an adventure. I packed sandwiches, filled the tank, and drove us out to Ocean Breeze Park, the kind of place with peeling paint on the carousel, but enough heart to still feel magical. As soon as we walked through the gates, she lit up like someone had turned a light back on. "Teacups," she shouted, running toward the ride before I'd even unzipped my jacket. We spent the day spinning in mismatched saucers, eating rainbow cotton candy, and screaming from the top of the rickety Ferris wheel. She laughed again, real laughter, the kind that made her cheeks pink and her dimples show. On the drive home, she fell asleep holding the giant stuffed parrot we won at the ring toss. I glanced at her face in the mirror and thought maybe, just maybe, I'd let my imagination get the best of me. But that illusion shattered 4 days later. It was a Wednesday. I was in a Zoom call with a marketing firm when the school called again. The aftercare supervisor had gone home sick, and parents needed to pick up kids early. I rescheduled my meeting and bolted out the door, barely remembering to grab my keys. When I arrived, Tessa was sitting on the school steps holding a folded piece of paper. "You weren't supposed to pick me up today," she said, surprised. I smiled and knelt beside her. "Today's a special day. Let's walk home, okay?" She handed me the paper. I drew us. "That's you, that's Grandma, and that's me." It was colorful and sweet, except there was no one else in the picture. No vidam, no isabegi. As we walked home under a soft spring breeze, she chatted again. She told me about how her friend Elena fell on the playground and got a Band-Aid shaped like a cat. She talked about mashed potatoes and the art room, and a boy named Carlos who called her Professor because she answered so many questions. I was starting to relax again, to think maybe this was just a phase. And then everything crashed. We turned the corner, and I saw them. 2 police cars parked in front of our building, lights off, but presence undeniable. An officer spotted us and started walking toward us with the kind of authority that makes your blood go cold even when you've done nothing wrong. "Are you Celia?" he asked, his tone clipped and formal. I said yes, and he nodded toward Tessa. "We've received a report that you unlawfully removed this child from school premises." For a second, I truly thought he was joking. "What?" "She's my daughter. I was called to pick her up." His expression didn't change. "We have documentation stating that custody belongs solely to Mr. Graham, and that you are not authorized for retrieval." My entire body went cold. "That's impossible," I said. "I have joint custody. We've had it for 2 years." He turned to Tessa and said, "Young lady, is this your mother?" And that's when I knew something terrible had been done to my child. She didn't answer. She looked at me with wide eyes, and then she looked down. She didn't say yes. She didn't say anything at all. The next moments felt like drowning. Another officer took my ID, then said it wasn't enough. I told them the custody papers were upstairs in my apartment. They said I'd have to come with them to the station to sort it out. And before I could even respond, the cuffs were on my wrists. Cold, tight metal. Tessa started crying. "Mommy," she said in a tiny voice as a female officer gently pulled her toward a separate vehicle. I tried to twist toward her, but the male officer pushed me forward. "She's safe," he said. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I was shoved into the back of a cruiser while neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. I couldn't scream. I couldn't sob. I could only sit there, breath frozen in my chest, watching my daughter disappear in the other car. And still, I didn't understand how they'd pulled it off. But I would, very soon. And when I found out what Graham had done, and how far he and Isabel had gone to rip my daughter away from me, it would turn every ounce of fear in my body into fire. When they pulled me out of the back of the cruiser and into the precinct, my hands were still cuffed, and my mouth felt like I'd swallowed sand. I kept asking to see my daughter, but no one answered me. No one told me where she was. A young officer took my fingerprints like I was some kind of repeat offender, then led me down a hallway painted in sickly beige into an interrogation room that smelled like metal and bleach. They took the cuffs off but left the door closed behind them, locking it with a click that hit harder than it should have. I sat alone at the steel table, breathing like someone had stepped on my chest, try to remember the exact location of our custody papers in the living room file cabinet. Evelyn would find them. She would bring them. She would fix this. I just had to hang on. It felt like a full hour before anyone came in. A detective in his mid-50s entered holding a thick folder and sat down across from me with a rehearsed expression of practiced neutrality. "Ms. Celia," he began, "we've received documentation stating that full legal custody of your daughter was granted to Mr. Graham approximately 6 months ago." I stared at him like he'd just spoken a different language. "That's not true," I said, my voice too loud, too sharp. "We have joint custody. Has for 2 years. I've never been notified of a hearing. That paperwork has to be fake." He watched me for a moment, probably judging whether I was unhinged or reasonable, then asked why my daughter hadn't verbally confirmed I was her mother. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even have a theory. I just kept replaying the moment on the sidewalk when she looked down instead of up. I told him I needed to call my mother immediately, that she would bring every single legal document required to prove I wasn't lying, that I wasn't crazy, and that they had made a mistake of the highest order. He hesitated, then pushed the phone across the table. Evelyn picked up after one ring, and when I explained what had happened, she didn't ask questions. She just said, "I'm coming. I've got everything. I'll call Aaron on the way." By the time she arrived at the station, she was holding two things: a thick manila folder packed with every court filing from our divorce and custody case, and the business card of our lawyer Aaron, who was already in his car and driving over. She pushed through the front desk like she owned the building and demanded to speak with the arresting officer. When they finally let her into the room with me, I collapsed in her arms, shaking with relief, with rage, with fear. She told me Tessa had been taken to a temporary child welfare holding site, not far from the station, and that she was in safe hands, which sounded like the kind of line they give parents to stop them from breaking down in public. The detective returned, flipping through the papers Evelyn had given him. "This does show joint custody," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Dated from over 2 years ago." But before anything could be confirmed, another officer opened the door and said calmly, "They're here." I looked past him and saw Graham and Isabel standing in the hallway like they were attending a parent-teacher conference instead of a criminal investigation. Graham was wearing a fitted suit, no tie, looking every inch the concerned father. Isabel was in a silk blouse tucked into crisp white slacks, her hair and makeup perfect, not a single thing out of place. Behind them stood a man in a gray pinstripe suit holding a slim leather briefcase. Their lawyer, clearly. "Where is our daughter?" Graham asked, not even glancing at me. "We'd like her released immediately into our care." His lawyer stepped forward and placed another folder on the table, stating, "Here is the revised custody document, approved and finalized in court 6 months ago." Evelyn immediately protested, saying we never received notification, never got served, nothing. The detective looked over the papers with a frown, then compared them to the ones we'd brought. "These don't line up," he muttered. That's when Aaron arrived, out of breath, but ready for blood. He took one look at the scene, then snapped the documents from the gray suit lawyer's hand and scanned them. "This is fabricated," he said sharply. "I was with Celia on the exact day this document says she was in court. We were in a different courthouse for an unrelated filing." The detective looked up. "Can you prove that?" "I can, with court logs and time-stamped record from my office," Aaron said. "And I will." Before anyone could argue further, a knock on the door pulled everyone's attention. "Tessa wants to speak," an officer said. "She asked for her mom." I stood instantly, but they stopped me. A female social worker walked in holding Tessa's hand. She looked so small, so scared. When she saw me, her lip trembled. "Mommy," she whispered and tried to run to me, but the social worker pulled her back. "Just a little longer," she said gently. The lead detective called in a child psychologist who was on staff for cases involving minors. Her name was Beatrice, and she spoke to Tessa in a small side room while the rest of us waited in a suffocating silence. Graham had stopped making eye contact entirely. Isabel was whispering rapidly to their lawyer, her voice increasingly strained. I could feel the walls closing in on them. I didn't want vengeance, not really, but I wanted my daughter back, and I wanted whoever did this to pay. An hour passed before Beatrice returned, her face grim. She looked at the detective first. "Tessa says her father and his wife told her they were playing a special game. In the game, she had to pretend Isabel was her real mother and that Celia was a stranger. If she did well, they told her she could come live with them full-time and never have to go back. If she messed up, she wouldn't see her daddy again." The room went still. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Evelyn let out a strangled gasp. Aaron stepped forward and said, "That is coercion. That is manipulation of a minor." That is abuse. The detective didn't even hesitate. He stood, turned to Graham and Isabel, and said coldly, "Graham, Isabel, you are under arrest for child endangerment, document forgery, false reporting, and interference with custody. You have the right to remain silent." Isabel started crying, repeating, "He told me to go along with it. I didn't know he was serious," but no one believed her. And as they were let out in handcuffs, I finally ran to my daughter and dropped to my knees. She wrapped her arms around my neck and cried into my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Mommy," she sobbed. "I didn't want to lie. I was scared." I kissed her head and held her close. "You didn't do anything wrong, baby," I whispered. "You're safe now. I've got you." But in the back of my mind, I already knew the damage had been done, and fixing what they broke would take more than a courtroom win. It would take time, love, and a hell of a lot of healing. The days that followed were a mess of legal procedures, psychological evaluations, and long, fragile silences that settled over our apartment like dust. Tessa clung to me in ways she hadn't since she was a toddler, and I let her. She wouldn't fall asleep unless my hand was resting on her chest. And even then, she'd wake in the middle of the night whispering things like, "Don't let them take me," or "Isabel said you didn't want me anymore." I didn't cry in front of her, I couldn't, but I cried in the hallway, in the bathroom, in the car, anytime I had 5 minutes to myself and no one watching. Aaron worked fast, faster than I thought the legal system even allowed. He gathered court records, filed injunctions, and made sure Graham and Isabel weren't able to post bail easily. Meanwhile, Beatrice, the psychologist who'd spoken with Tessa, set up twice-weekly sessions in her small private office not far from the elementary school. Tessa liked her instantly, maybe because she didn't speak to her like she was a broken toy. "She lets me draw instead of talking," Tessa said one afternoon. "Then we talk after." The hearing came 2 weeks later. Graham looked like a ghost of himself in a wrinkled suit, while Isabel had swapped her expensive blouses for a plain cardigan and zero makeup. I sat 2 rows behind them in the courtroom, clutching a printed copy of the custody agreement like it was a lifeline. Evelyn held my hand the entire time, squeezing every time something horrible was said aloud. The judge wasn't subtle about his anger when he heard about the forged documents, the false police report, and the manipulation of a child to execute what was basically a legal abduction. They were both found guilty. Graham received a 4-year sentence and Isabel 3. Neither of them spoke to me once, not even when they were being led out of the courtroom in cuffs. Graham looked at the floor the whole time, and Isabel just kept crying, mouthing, "I'm sorry," to anyone who would meet her eyes. I didn't care. I didn't need an apology. I needed them gone. After the sentencing, it felt like we should have been able to breathe again, but trauma doesn't follow a timeline. For weeks, Tessa wouldn't go near any man in a uniform. She flinched at the sound of sirens, even if it was just an ambulance on the street. Her drawings slowly returned to color, but they often included walls, always thick, towering walls around the figures. I knew what that meant. Beatrice said it was common, a symbol of control, a way to keep safe what had once been stolen. I adjusted my work schedule, converting most of my client calls to remote and only accepting projects that didn't require late nights. Ray took on more responsibility at the studio, and for once, I allowed myself to lean on people. Evelyn stayed our rock, cooking, cleaning, taking Tessa on slow walks through the neighborhood while I answered emails or filed legal documents, or just stared out the window, trying to understand how a person I once loved could justify turning our child into a pawn. 3 months later, the old apartment started to feel like a cage, so I started browsing listings in quieter areas, neighborhoods where people still left handwritten notes on bulletin boards and a corner bakery near your name. I found a modest 2-story house in Charleston, with a white fence, a patchy garden, and just enough space for Evelyn to have her own room upstairs. We moved in early spring. Tessa picked the smallest bedroom on purpose, said it felt cozier. I painted the walls pale yellow, and she filled it with paper lanterns and animal stickers. The first night in the new house, Tessa asked if we could all sleep in the same room, just for one night. I laid a sleeping bag on the floor beside her bed, and Evelyn took the old recliner from the living room. We all fell asleep watching a documentary about whales, Tessa's hand curled in mine, her breathing finally calm. A few weeks later, she came home from school with a big sheet of poster paper and showed me her newest art project. We were supposed to draw our family, she said. On it were three figures holding hands, me, her, and Evelyn, smiling in front of the house with tulips in the yard. I didn't even try to hide the tears. That evening, while unpacking one of the last boxes in the living room, she asked out of nowhere, "Mommy, what's a real family?" I sat down beside her and thought for a moment. A real family is made of people who protect you and love you without needing anything in return. It's not about names or blood or who signs papers. It's about who shows up. She stared at the floor for a while, then nodded and said, "Then we're real. You, me, and Grandma." Those words hit me harder than any verdict or apology ever could. She'd been through the kind of manipulation that breaks most adults, and still, she believed in love. Still, she believed in us. Later that night, while Evelyn and I sat on the small back porch sipping tea, she said, "You did it, Celia. You pulled her through." I shook my head. "No," I said. "We did. I couldn't have done this alone." And even though there were still court follow-ups, therapy appointments, and school meetings in our future for the first time in over a year, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were finally coming home. 1 year after the worst day of my life, we stood in front of our new house, holding fresh keys and grocery bags, watching the sun stretch shadows across the white fence that now enclosed our small slice of peace. Tessa was wearing a paper crown she'd made in school, the kind covered in glue and glitter and letters that spelled Queen of my castle. Evelyn was beside her. Holding a bag of tulip bulbs for the garden, she insisted we plant together before summer. And I, after everything, was okay. Not perfect, not whole, but okay in a way that feels earned, like something stitched back together after too many seams have been ripped apart. The court case had ended months ago. Graham was serving his 4-year sentence, Isabel got 3, and both were barred from contacting Tessa until she turned 18. The forged paperwork, the complicit police officer, even the courthouse clerk. Every piece of their sick little operation had been exposed. The officer lost his badge. The clerk was prosecuted. Even their lawyer faced sanctions for knowingly submitting altered records. They'd built a trap for me, and every part of it had fallen in on them instead. But the victory didn't erase the damage. Tessa's nightmares didn't vanish overnight. There were mornings she still checked the locks on her window, days she got quiet for no reason, hours she needed me to sit beside her just to do simple things like brush her hair or pack her school bag. I didn't push her. I didn't ask for more than she was ready to give. I just stayed close, steady. I promised her she would never have to doubt where she belonged again, and I made damn sure to keep that promise. Therapy continued with Beatrice, and the sessions changed over time. At first, they were about fear, then confusion, then trust. Now they were about resilience, about giving Tessa the tools to understand what had happened without letting it define her. Beatrice told me she was one of the strongest kids she'd ever met. I told her I wasn't surprised. She came from a line of women who refused to be broken. My business survived the storm, though not without bruises. I had to scale back projects and rebuild my reputation after missing deadlines during the chaos. But some of my longtime clients understood. One even sent a bouquet of sunflowers with a note that read, "Family comes first. Always." That one sat in our kitchen for weeks until the petals finally fell and I pressed one into a photo album with a picture of Tessa holding her stuffed parrot from the amusement park. Then came the day I received a message from Isabel. She'd been out of jail for 2 months. I didn't even know she had access to contact me. It came through a mutual connection on an old social media account I hadn't deleted. The message was short. "I know I don't deserve a response. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I hope Tessa is okay." I didn't reply. I didn't even type one. I just blocked the account and sat there staring at the screen, letting the silence answer for me. Evelyn had started going to community yoga classes in the park and had even begun dating again, though she pretended not to. Tessa teased her mercilessly and kept referring to a man named Jack as Grandma's boyfriend, which made Evelyn sputter every time. Seeing her come back to life reminded me just how much she'd given up to keep me from drowning. The house became our new rhythm. Breakfast with sunlight through the kitchen window, weekend mornings at the farmer's market, evenings spent drawing at the dining room table, while we played music and talked about nothing important. It was exactly what we needed, ordinary and safe in ours. Then one afternoon, I found Tessa sitting on the porch, legs swinging off the edge, writing in a small journal Beatrice had given her. She looked up and said, "Mommy, do you think people who do bad things always stay bad?" I sat beside her, letting the question hang in the air. "I think people can change," I said slowly, "but it doesn't mean you owe them your trust again. You can forgive someone without letting them hurt you again." She nodded, her brow furrowed like she was trying to fold the idea into a shape that made sense. Then she said, "I don't miss them. I just wish they hadn't lied to me." That night, she asked to sleep with the window open for the first time since everything happened. I stood in the hallway listening to her breathe, steady and calm, as moonlight spilled across her bed. And in that moment, I knew we'd made it through. Not untouched, not unscarred, but through. A few weeks later, she came home with a certificate from school. It wasn't for grades or attendance or reading the most books. It was for kindness. Her teacher had nominated her because she helped a younger student who was crying at recess. She told him his mom would come back, the teacher said, then sat with him until she did. I sat in my car afterward and cried for 10 full minutes. If you'd asked me a year ago whether I'd ever feel safe again, I probably would have said no. But now, I get to wake up every morning knowing my daughter is in her bed, my mother is in a room upstairs, and no one is coming to take anything from us ever again. We built something real here. We earned it. And if you're someone reading this who's in the middle of the storm, feeling like the system is too big, the lies too heavy, the fear too loud, listen to me. Keep your records. Keep your circle close. Trust your gut. Document everything. And never, ever let them convince you that love isn't enough to win. Because sometimes love isn't soft. Sometimes it's fierce. Sometimes it's teeth and fire and standing up in a courtroom even when your knees are shaking. We're not just okay. We're better. And we're never going back.